Hello, today we're talking about Eva Smith, arguably the focal point of J.B. Priestley's spellbinding thriller An Inspector Calls. Now, although she's never seen in this play, Eva has a very powerful influence over the action. Who is responsible for Eva Smith's death? This is a question that reverberates throughout the play. Yes, she committed suicide, but she took her own life because she was driven to this desperate act by the heartless actions of the Burling family. The inspector's function then, or one of his functions, is to haunt the Burlings and to investigate this death. It's symbolic, I believe, that she is not present in this play. That's symbolic, that's intentional by Priestley, because what he's trying to do here is this. He's trying to suggest that capitalist society has marginalised Eva, denied her a voice. Bourgeois exploitation has compelled the inspector to have to speak for her because she lacks the power to be heard in this society. Now, I'm a pretty squeamish mum, and whenever the inspector starts harping on with the eye-watering 18 certificate details about Eva's death, I always wince. He's often saying things like, she was burnt out, of course, and she died in great agony. He's at pains to drive home the agonising nature of her death. But this links to one of the inspector's functions. What he's trying to do is to shock the Burlings out of their complacency, their capitalist self-interest, and compel them to realise that their heartless behaviour has horrific consequences. Their casual sins end in the agonising death of Eva Smith. And this is a point the inspector is very keen to drive home most vigorously. As perhaps you already know, Eva Smith is a cipher, a symbol, a representative, call it what you will, of the working class, the proletariat. So her death at the hands of the Burling family, who represent capitalist interests, this can be seen as a metaphor for the way capitalism destroys the poor. Eva Smith dies, that reflects capitalism destroying the proletariat. And it's interesting, Priestley's very clever in having each one of the Burling family members commit a biblical sin against Eva. What Priestley is trying to suggest here is that the treatment of Eva by this family, and by extension by capitalist society, by capitalist machination, is that it's almost immoral, perhaps almost evil, to treat the poor this way. Sins, let's look at these sins very quickly. Mr. Burling sacks Eva because she has the temerity to ask for more money. He believes, in fact I'm sure he'll have it chiselled on his gravestone, he believes in lower costs and higher prices. He's always going to put profit before people's welfare. So he sacks Eva for asking for higher wages. His sin is greed. Sheila did not like it one bit that Eva looked prettier in that dress at the department store. I think Eva also might have smirked at her or something. So she used her influence, her social position, did Sheila, and she got Eva fired. She got her hoyed out the door. So jealousy compelled her to this heartless act. Gerald took Eva as his mistress, and he drops her like a hot snot once he's had his fun. So his sin is lust, very much driven by a sexual urge there. Also, you could say because he basked in the gratitude of this very pretty young girl, perhaps pride was also one of his sins. Eric rapes Eva, and he does so when he's intoxicated by alcohol. So you could say that his sins are lust and perhaps gluttony as well, overindulgence in alcohol. Mrs. Burling denies Eva charity, heartless, icy woman. I'm sure she gets frostbite on her earlobes. She is that cold. And Mrs. Burling denies Eva charity because Eva had the temerity, the cheek, the nerve to call herself Mrs. Burling. A disgrace to the family name, and so it's perhaps pride that compelled her to be so cruel towards Eva. Now, the treatment of the poor by the rich in this play, I believe Priestley is trying to say, it goes against God. It violates moral laws, if not legal ones. Because let's be honest, in 1912, nobody's going to go to jail for firing a working class girl. Nobody's going to go to jail for getting her flung out of a department store or denying her charity. But Priestley compounds the sin, reinforces the wrongness of the Burling's behaviour towards Eva by having Eva appear as such a virtuous person. How is she virtuous? Well, she's a good character, a moral character, because she fights for workers' rights. That's one of the reasons she got fired from the Burling business. Secondly, she refuses to have anything to do with Eric's stolen money. And this flies in the face of those nasty prejudices, those nasty assumptions that Mrs. Burling has about girls of that class. So the Burlings are sinful, and what highlights or compounds that sense of injustice is the fact that the victim of their sin is so noble and virtuous. We've talked about Eva Smith being a cipher for the working class. Her name, as you might have deduced already, is significant. Smith is a common name, and it suggests that Eva Smith represents the common man, the everyman. Now, it was a trope or a convention of morality plays, which were very big in the Middle Ages. They were plays that kind of very clunkily peddled a message or a moral to their audience. It was very common for these plays to use what's known as label names. So the characters' names would allude or refer to their function or nature. As such, you'd have a goody two-shoes character called Good Deeds. The villain of the piece, the real right wrong-un, would be called Vice. And perhaps you'd get a guy who reflected the everyday bloke, the average Joe, and he'd be called Everyman. So we can see Priestley kind of updating the morality play for the 20th century. It's often called, this play, a modern morality play because, of course, it's trying to sell the moral or the message that socialism is preferable to capitalism. And it also appropriates this convention of the label names with Eva Smith. We've talked about Smith. Perhaps we can do something with the word Eva as well when we're analysing language in this play. Eve, as you know, comes from the Bible. Adam and Eve were forcibly evicted from the Garden of Eden, when Eve took a bite of the apple. And perhaps we can see a parallel between Eve from the Bible's story and Eva Smith's. Eve in the Bible, her life was ruined by the satanic influence of the snake, and perhaps we could say that Eva Smith's life was ruined by the satanic influence, the evil influence, the heartless, cold, callous, immoral influence of the Burling family. The rape. It is implied that Eric raped Eva. I think the phrase he uses is something like, I was at the stage where a chap turns nasty. He doesn't explicitly say he raped her. He tries to kind of sanitise his words. He tries to employ euphemism. I was at the stage where a chap turns nasty. This is a fantastic metaphor. And if you can talk about this in an exam, it really is a fast track to A-star glory. This rape captures or symbolises the way that Priestley saw the ruling tier, that bourgeois class, exploiting and abusing the proletariat. So always a win if you can talk about the rape and its metaphorical or symbolic significance in the exam. Eva changes her name, turns herself into Daisy Renton. Perhaps we can argue that this name is symbolic. She's rented, picked up, used and disposed of by the Burling family. She's something you hire, simply a plaything of the rich, and perhaps her name telegraphs that. It's significant that Eva is pregnant when she dies. because in effect, Mr. and Mrs. Burling, by mistreating Eva so abominably, killed their own grandchild. And this act is symbolic, and it gets to the real meat of Priestley's message. Priestley's saying that if you mistreat the poor, ultimately you're going to hurt yourself. And we see that happening here with the callous actions of the Burlings yielding that horrific death of their grandchild. And Gould's parting words really reinforce this idea that we hurt ourselves in the long run if we hurt other people. He says, we are all responsible for each other. There's his socialist message, promoting that idea of community over base self-interest, the individual. And then he goes on to say, if men will not learn this lesson, then they will be taught in fire and blood and anguish. And we can pull a couple of things out here, which is really going to rock an examiner's world. First of all, this line is a reference to social revolution, with the poor rising up against their bourgeois oppressors. This isn't fairy tales, folks. 1789 in France, 1917 in Russia. Arguably, social revolution here was fostered by the poor being sick of grubbing along at the bottom, and they decided to very violently remove that ruling tier of society. And perhaps Gould's message about the fire and the blood and the anguish is a nod to the working class rising up and stomping the Burlings. You damaged the Evas and John Smiths of this world, so says Inspector Gould, you're shoring up a world of hurt for yourself later down the line. So, to conclude, Eva Smith, a very moral, decent young girl whose life is hideously destroyed. First it's deformed, then it's destroyed by the Burlings' sinful behaviour. She's a cipher or a symbol for that exploited working class, and she's also a tool used by the inspector to teach the Burlings the concept of community and force them to throw off their capitalist ways and embrace a more socialist ethos. And that, in a nutshell, is Eva Smith.